I first came across Stephen's writings through his blog Reignite when I was training for ministry. Discovering Reignite gave me an opportunity to realize that this was also part of Unitarianism, that this kind of theological approach and this outlook that so chimed with me and with my outlook was out there. And it gave me, a huge reassurance and confidence boost to find that that blog Reignite, and it still does, and it's still frequent recourse to me. And how you keep it up, Stephen, I've no idea, but you do consistently write brilliantly, and alongside your theological and spiritual writings, you also share this absolutely focused concern with our numbers and with congregational decline. And every year at GA, there's a mail out, and we send in our membership numbers, and you've been meticulous in detailing that decline year by year. And so I think that Seeking Paradise really does bring together those concerns of yours, your theological acumen with your concern and sorrow about the state of Unitarian, current Unitarian tradition. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, if I may, to just bring us into this conversation. I'd like to ask first about how you discovered Unitarianism and where that discovery first came from. Where did that interest emerge?
Yeah, it was when I was a student originally, studying science in Birmingham. I was going through a period of searching for a lot of different things. This was, the age of the internet just about, and it would have been very different if it had been 5 years earlier, I think. But there was a possibility to just search and do a lot of research online into kind of every religion and every permutation of religion that I was searching for at that point. I think it was actually A History of God by Karen Armstrong, which is such a profound and beautiful book, that I first heard about Unitarians. And it was like a paragraph, if it was that. It was just, in talking about the Reformation, there was a reference to the Polish Unitarians who continue to be an influence on me. But there was just, there were different groups in the Reformation, and there were these Unitarians, these Socinians in Poland, and they had an emphasis not on the death of Jesus on the cross, but on Jesus's teachings, and that's what they did. And I sort of thought, well, that's what I'm interested in. That's what I want. And I had no idea if it was still something that existed, and it doesn't still exist in Poland. That particular expression of Unitarianism does no longer exist because of persecution. But obviously, Googling, or probably slightly pre-Google in those days, finding there was a Unitarian community in my city where I was, and finding out and going along there. Explored Quakerism as well at that point, and there was always I'm always close to being a Quaker as well. But Unitarianism is what drew me in deeper and deeper. Although the congregation that I went to was without a minister, wasn't particularly dynamic. It was struggling. It was small numbers. It was without a minister. It was in that time, and it was, so I was never under kind of any illusions about things. It always felt like something that wasn't living up to its potential in lots of ways. But the gravity of it kept pulling me in, and I kept studying and reading around this tradition that I find so interesting.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, really, was once you arrived, what were your first impressions? Because I know that a lot of us feel that there's something we don't exactly do what we say on the tin, you know, that
Mm.
we can sometimes people can arrive and feel, oh, this isn't what I expected.
Mm.
But it's really interesting to me that some of us persist nevertheless, and you were obviously one of those. Can you say a bit more about what it was that made you want to persist? What was it that held you?
It's a very mysterious. It's a very mysterious thing, actually. I mean, there were things that just felt wonderfully refreshing. Things like quoting from Baha'i scriptures. I remember a service that talked about the Baha'i scriptures and that those words of humanity is one, the world is my country, and humanity is one, and all that sense of the oneness of religions was very exciting to me, because that was kind of my sticking point from my Anglican Christian kind of background. Because I grew up in a multi-religious society, and that exclusivism was always what I struggled with most. So that inclusive vision of religions is something that was, yeah, very, very stimulating and very exciting to me. Yeah, and it wasn't long after I came to Unitarianism, a year or so, or 2 years, and then I went to the States and was involved in UU congregations, Unitarian Universalist congregations in Boston. Which is not to say that I've never been of the opinion that the Americans are doing everything right and we just need to copy what they're doing, because it's different culture, different situation. But it did enable me to experience a larger congregation, which
Yeah.
more kind of potential for growth and connection.
Yes, the fact of kinetic momentum. That yes, it's true that whenever two or three of you are gathered together, but somehow it's more when there's more of you gathered together. I don't know how that exactly plays out, but I remember being in a Quaker meeting, very small Quaker meeting, that I was steward of for a while, and our usual numbers were 3 or 4, and it was wonderful that they very often used to actually maintain silence. Once we were visited by another congregation of Quakers, and I don't know how, because it was in silence, but that greater configuration of people in the room just created a different experience. It's really interesting.
Mm. And there are, there are pros and cons of smallness and bigness. This is I'm not a big is better person, and I'm not, as we'll explore, it's not all about the numbers for me. But there are.
Yeah.
I had both those experiences.
There's definitely lots of things that we're already discovering that I'd like to go further with. And I'm really interested that you mentioned that on your first discovery of Unitarianism, it was something from Baha'i that answered for you that kind of question about exclusivism. I had the same experience. My very first visit to a Unitarian service began with a quotation from the Tao Te Ching and allowed me in. But you also talked about tradition. And I think that is one of the themes that's central to Seeking Paradise. That in order to develop our mission, we need to understand and work with our tradition. So if we were to move into talking about Seeking Paradise, can I ask about that tradition and what are the key elements of our tradition for you that without which this tradition wouldn't be the same?
Yeah, I guess my journey into Unitarianism, I've had a curiosity to, like, well, what is it? I've been driven by a curiosity to kind of go deeper and deeper into what it is. And I'm explicit in kind of the book that what I'm operating out of is what I call classical Unitarianism. It's the Unitarianism of the General Assembly object,
Yeah.
partly, and I'm operating out of a kind of a discovery and a belief that that we are a particular tradition in and of ourselves, that we're not a blank space in which other traditions fit, but we are. We stand in a particular place, and that there are riches, there are particular spiritual riches that come within our own tradition, as there are in other traditions, but we have our own spiritual tradition as well. Some of what those things are, I think, partly what you've read out today in that prayer meditation that we've had, it summarizes a lot of it, which I would talk about the intimacy and the immediacy of the holy, that actually there is a spirituality and a theology we have that is a constant drive towards the presence, that is not about going to heaven in an elsewhere, or the kingdom of God in the future. You know, we can come back to those themes, but it's a constant drive to the now and to the among us. That the holy is supremely present. James Martineau talks about this. He's got quite a lovely kind of image. He talks about, you can find, you know, that we need to, I'm paraphrasing here, but God is as present here as in the Garden of Eden or the Garden of Gethsemane. And if we can't find God in the here and the now, in your own garden, in your own room, you cannot find God in the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane. That the presence of divinity is not something that has ceased or was a long time ago or a faraway place. It is here. It is now. That's very much a kind of transcendentalist spirituality in Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and that New England transcendentalism is a large part of that kind of spirituality. And it's also in its modern kind of, its more contemporary expression, is in the work of Rebecca Parker, who's a living Unitarian Universalist theologian, who's kind of been a deep influence shaping the writing that I've done, and her work on paradise with Rita Nakashima Brock, in discovering that spirituality of presence, of beauty, of oneness, of paradise in the here and now, in the act of worship and spiritual practice, in the existence of the moment. And so that's kind of, that intimacy is there, that immediacy of holiness, to me is very foundational going through our tradition. There's other things like the concept of, and these things are kind of interlinked, the continuity of revelation, that revelation is not sealed, which is expressed really well by James Luther Adams, kind of great 20th century American theologian, and what that means in terms of liberalism, in terms of what it is to be liberally religious, that because truth is unfolding and revelation is not sealed, our approach is the seeking of truth, the working out the truth, and that means we're a self-critical tradition. And James Luther Adams is very good on this, saying what it means to be a liberal is to be a self-critical tradition. And we don't always realize that, because sometimes we're more keen to be critical of other people's tradition than our own tradition. But actually what it is to be liberal is to be engaged and committed to a tradition, but actually do so in a critical way, and that is asking questions of the tradition constantly, and kind of seeking a process of conversation and argument around the tradition, and living into that. I would also lift up the teaching of Jesus, the concentration on the teaching particularly of Jesus, not about Jesus, not a speculation about the nature of Jesus, that kind of Christological conversation, but constantly going back to what did Jesus actually say, which again I would get from the Polish Unitarians,
Mm.
with the kind of emphasis on pacifism, on peace, on simplicity, on rejection of wealth and power,
Mm.
some of those radical Anabaptist practices that, you know, ultimately, it's a particular historical expression, but ultimately kind of are rooted in taking Jesus' words seriously, and that sense of commitment and discipleship that comes from that. And finally, I just kind of lift up what is the major key in universalism and the minor key in Unitarianism, which is the love of God. That sense of the discovery of love, that love is the foundation of existence, the divinity, whatever it is, whatever God is love. And that's also in someone like Richard Wright's, the Unitarian missionary that I cover in the book, who was as much a universalist as a Unitarian, and that was kind of his kind of, in his words, primitive Christianity, a kind of simple Christianity of the loving nature of divinity, and our and how that love needs to flow through us. I've been reading a lot of Georges de Benville as well, an 18th century French British American universalist, and he writes beautifully about that kind of thing, that love is the foundation and love is the beginning and the end of it all.
Yeah, that's marvelous. I've just recently been really enjoying reading our colleague Bob Janice Dillon's revision and translation of the Gospel of Mark, and one of the things that comes across very forcefully in that translation, but actually throughout Mark anyway, is Jesus' immense courage, which I just think is very useful for us to consider at this time in particular, when we can be so persuaded into going along with the anxiety of our times. The great teaching of love that actually is without fear, it's fearless, which is just lovely. And I you know, very, very much agree with all of those teachers that you've raised up there. I'm interested in the paradox as well, though, that James Luther Adams talks about the self-critical tradition, and there is a very venerable tradition within Unitarianism of that we can sometimes be, I think, fairly accused of talking more about ourselves than anything else. And I suppose that's the danger of being the self-critical tradition, is that our focus turns inwards.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I talk about is the need for kind of a self-transcending message. That, you know, we can talk endlessly about ourselves, and actually, as you know, as important as traditions are, and I'm you know, really big on traditions. I think a tradition is not I think spiritual traditions are not about self-referencing themselves, but about pointing to something.
Right.
And I think that's often what we fail to do.
Right. And I think that that's very, very much the heart of your book.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things that I was going to say about Seeking Paradise, a term that is new to me, that I came across at our Art of Spiritual Hosting, Gavin mentioned this idea of wounded words, that some words are so freighted with luggage that they become wounded in some way, and it's almost impossible to use them without having to unpack them and to kind of deal with people's associations and negative associations with a lot of those words. And tradition is one such, and I think that you really helpfully point in Seeking Paradise up the idea that tradition doesn't have to be about the old and the kind of accretions of a dusty, fusty, ancestral religious tradition, but it can be a conversation. It can be a way of gathering language appropriate to our needs. And that also feels something that we most require right now in this crisis. But I think this current viral crisis is only one element of a wider crisis that we're living through at the moment. There are other wounded words, and I think mission is another one which a lot of Unitarians can't help but feel is refers to something from our colonial history, something from the us and them version of kind of religious transmission. Can you say something about what mission is in your mind and in this book?
Yeah. So let me start at the beginning and then I'll come around to that. I mean, the book starts with a resolution we passed 14 years ago, possibly to the day. It was at the annual meeting, so I don't know exactly when it was, which said we need to grow.
Yeah.
Right, which said in order to survive, there is an absolute need for numerical growth.
Yeah.
Which I was at. It was my first annual meetings, and I was there. I was a delegate for my congregation. I voted for it. I passed it. We passed it overwhelmingly. I don't think it was unanimous, but it was overwhelming. Yeah, we said yeah. As you said, I paid attention to the numbers over the years, and sometimes felt surprised we're not paying more attention to the numbers over the years, because the numbers are falling, right? And this was a resolution said numbers are falling. We got to do something about it. We've got to prioritize it. Fine. But then what I come back to, what I thought since, and more in the process of the last few years, is asking why. Like why?
Yeah.
Why do we have to grow? Like we have to grow in order to survive. But then why do we have to survive? Like what? To keep asking the why question, right? That's the theological question. Like, why? What is the point of what is the actual point of what we're doing? Why does it matter?
Yeah.
Right. So to ask that question is to ask the question of mission. Like, what is the purpose? What is the mission of what we're doing? What are we actually doing? What do we think we're doing? What's it for? You know, whether you use the word mission or not, that's the question we're asking. I take very seriously the kind of the missionary kind of the association, particularly a word like missionary, in terms of colonialism. Although the history is nuanced, it's yeah. But if you look across mission kind of mission history, and I sort of by accident I've been trained by like some really some of the world's best kind of mission historians in Boston and elsewhere. It's a complicated history. Sometimes missionaries resisted imperial power and worked alongside other people of non-European countries. But of course, this is through the framework of a white supremacy, an empire, and colonialism. That exists, and it's to be taken seriously. But Unitarians have done mission. They have done foreign missions. Well, a little bit. We've had a little bit of foreign missions in India, but largely in the UK, British Unitarians or in Britain have done. There's a long history of mission, and that word has meant different things over the years. It's meant preaching. It's meant kind of social work. It's kind of meant presenting a message. So that word it does exist quite strongly in the history, in our history.
Yeah.
It exists still in the names of some districts.
Yeah.
And it's really whether the word mission is used or not. It's asking the deeper question of purpose. And that my constant point is that you can't do the how without the why. You have to have an answer to the question of purpose, of what it's for.
Yeah.
And that's a question of mission.
Yeah. There was a little segment. I wondered if you'd mind if I just read it out. It's something. It's from Seeking Paradise, and it seemed to me it's at the beginning of your 4th chapter, and you speak about the real need for faith. And it really spoke to me just this morning as I was looking at it. Given where we are right now, you're talking about being in a campaign meeting. And you said, how can we not lose hope? How can we not burn out and run out of energy? How can we have a community that supports people in this work? How can we not become depressed and despairing? How can we link the personal to the global? How can we not just give the bad news of climate change, but give some good news of how the world might be if we took the action that's needed? And you speak about the Cardiff-based artist and activist Rabab Ghazul, who coined this phrase radical imagination. And you go on to say, I would suggest that another name for radical imagination might be faith. And then you say how we as Unitarians have sometimes struggled with what our faith might be able to do. And it's precisely on this question, what hope can Unitarians bring? What faith? And that very much, as you've just been saying, that is at the center of this book, and it's at the center of your continual questioning. Why? So what is the answer for you? How do we approach this question? What is our faith and how do we share it?
So what I say is that to be able to have an answer to those sorts of questions that feel very live questions in the circles that I move in activist communities, and you know, to be honest, beyond that, in anyone, in anyone in any circumstances. To me, the purpose of faith is to be able to say, here is the problem inherent in what it is to be human, and here is the solution, right? But we have, there's a problem that there's, yeah, I can't think of a better way of putting it. There's a problem in what it is to be human.
Yeah.
And we have an answer to that, right?
Yeah.
We've struggled to do that because we struggle to have a theology of salvation, I would say. So my the best answer I've been able to discover and construct in this theological work is that the fundamental problem is disconnection, is isolation, which has a particular flavor in this moment, as we are physically disconnected, but connected in ways we can do in this moment. There's a strange reality to that in terms of our disconnection and our connection in this moment, right? This crisis, such that it is, will end, but I think there is a deeper fundamental problem in human life, and maybe even particularly in our society in this point in history, which is that problem or disconnection, and therefore the solution is relationship, is oneness, is connection, is reconciliation, is all of those things, a deeper connection with each other, with ourselves, with the earth, with God, with our bodies, with ourselves. That deeper connection, which is a faith, I would say.
So can I just ask, can you say something about about the relationship between those words connection and salvation?
Yeah, I mean, salvation is a word that maybe hides as much as it reveals in our minds. I mean, I'm tempted to use a more kind of technical word, but that doesn't, in the kind of soteriology, but that doesn't really help us in a way, but at least gets us out of that word salvation.
I know it's one of those wounded words, isn't it? And I just,
right.
As you were speaking, I just wondered if within this context of the presence of the holy, the immediacy of the divine, the emergence of revelation, whether connection is almost synonymous with salvation, that it's almost that because I mean, another way around the woundedness of the word salvation is that people will talk about it means healing. It comes from the word salve. Right. But is it perhaps that the healing we most need is this the recreation of connection? Connections are breaking.
Absolutely, yeah. And I kind of use the word salvation in a theological conversation, and a theology of salvation in because that's kind of just sort of technically the best way of talking about it. But actually, in terms of the language that we would choose to use, or that I would choose to use, would be around healing, around awakening. I mean, enlightenment. I mean, that's getting into a sort of slightly borrowing words from other traditions, but you know, maybe that's okay. But it is yes, it is a healing. It is a connection. It is a realizing of the reality of connection. And so the language, which, you know, this is a playing with language. That's, you know, I freely admit this is a language is to be played with. But the playing with the language that I do is the language of paradise, as influenced by Rebecca Parker, as a way of speaking about this. That paradise is both the experience of the reality of that connection, experience, a felt sense of the love and the oneness all around us, as well as the radical imagination, the use of imagination to imagine a world, a future that is possible for us in history, that we can imagine how the world might be, how the world could be, through that act of imagining. So it's an experience in the present, and it's an imagining into the future. And that's a faith. I think that both of those things are kind of are a faith. But I'd want to say a bit more as well, because I think that problem of disconnection, it's more than that. It's not just like a neutral kind of thing. It's that disconnection mutates into its own system, into its own way of being, into a kind of worldview of power over, because we are in our connection with one another is a power with a power alongside. But when we operate from disconnection, from defensiveness, from ego, that expresses itself as seeking power over others, which through kind of the processes of history and of particular histories of people, of places, exists as empire, and as different historical empires, and as empires of white supremacy, of colonialism, of high capitalist neoliberalism, but become an alternative faith. So it's also, when I want to talk about paradise, I also want to draw a distinction between faith in paradise and faith in empire, which is the distortion of this disconnection. And we can see that in kind of some of the conversations in this moment, where some people are saying, maybe we have to sacrifice some people for the sake of the economy, right? When the system becomes such that we value that system over human life, then that, I mean, I struggle to use any other word but demonic for that, because it is a kind of a false religion then. If it's demanding, if our system and our belief in that system we think is greater than the value of human life, then there's something has gone very, very disconnected and very, very badly wrong. And so it's that empire is a symptom of our spiritual disconnection, and the faith in paradise that I want to talk about is also a kind of a faith of resistance to those powers of empire, because we as liberals are much better at naming the falsehood of particular types of conservative religion than we are in naming the falsehood of kind of our economic systems, which are just as destructive, if not more destructive, and we're not as articulate in being able to put that critical eye onto the economic and cultural systems that we're a part of in this society, in this moment in history.
Yeah, that's really helpful point to make, actually. I think bringing the political directly into the spiritual realm. And I think it's also really helpful to point out that ours can be a hopeful faith if salvation works with this notion of the eternal now, that the kingdom is contemporary and present with us. We just actually have to articulate it and make it and participate in its emergence.
Yeah, it's the hope is also a distinctive commitment of the Unitarian tradition, of the liberal tradition.
Yes.
Is a sense of hope, not just in a kind of a supernatural apocalypse, but in the possibility within history, ultimately of hope. And that word ultimately is doing a lot of carrying, right? Yeah. It's doing a lot. But there is something of the attitude of liberalism that is hopeful.
Yeah. I'm aware that a lot of people in the room are sitting on their hands and holding in questions that they're desperate to ask. Myself, I could talk to you all afternoon, Stephen, but I know we've got a time frame around this conversation. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to take questions in about 10 minutes and open those up. But before we move to those questions from the room, as it were, I just want to touch on another element of the book. The reading that I just shared from chapter 4. The chapter is on pluralism, and you and I have both touched on how influential that aspect of Unitarianism has been for both of us. That our first interactions with Unitarians was coloured by or marked by use of scriptures from other sources, but you're quite critical of the tendency towards Unitarianism, towards pluralism in contemporary Unitarianism. You point out that we're not really as diverse as we like to think we are, and that many congregations in the Church of England, for example, could celebrate an equally diverse theological range, while we still, I would argue, suffer from a kind of lack of diversity in other demographic areas. Um, and the other area which you critique carefully is the atheistic humanist strand of contemporary Unitarianism. And I just wanted to ask you to say a little more about that. There's another quote I'll just read. You say, "It is important to be clear that we're operating with an openness to the possibility of transcendence, an openness to the possibility that the symbol God points to something worth considering." And I just want to ask, given that we have many Unitarian atheists and humanists who we love, but who are unlikely to respond to that call, how do you foresee those tensions playing out? And I sometimes feel as though we're caught between an irresistible force and an immovable object when it comes to this question. So I'm asking with a certain hesitancy and a certain tenderness in my heart, but how does that work for you?
So let me deal with the kind of pluralism thing first,
Sure.
which is related. Yeah, so one of the, I suppose I kind of talk about what our models of mission, like what our faith might be, and one of the kind of persistent ones is kind of sort of pluralism in itself, celebrating diversity as our mission, right? And that is like that does provide some form of self-transcendent mission in viewing that as a sense of mission. As I say, there are, I critique that because for a number of reasons, as you say, we're not actually sort of infinitely diverse. I never met like a Sikh Unitarian, you know, we're not. And if there was one, there might be, you know, the numbers will be tiny. And it builds on a particular kind of individualistic, atomized kind of philosophy that what matters most is the individual rather than the communal. That one can be religious, that one's religious identity only is for oneself and not a shared thing with a community. And also that, I don't go too much into that, but there, yeah, we've both talked about the reading of other scriptures in our worship, which I do. I do as a worship leader. There is always a danger of cultural misappropriation in that, of bringing in, of clumsily bringing in, if not stealing things from other cultures and religions. And I think that's, I'm not going to be very articulate here, but I would observe that kind of celebrating diversity is something that white people talk about. People I know who are activists, anti-racist activists, don't really talk about celebrating diversity. They talk about decolonizing, and that's an analysis of power and white supremacy and privilege, white privilege, and all of those things. And actually, that's a sort of a more humble place to be coming from. It's not, and I think if we don't do that work around power, then our understanding of diversity can be cannot realize the power we have in saying, I'm the powerful one that's going to bring in all these aspects of different religions, and it's going to come under my umbrella. So that's there's a lot of problems with that that I'd want to lift up. On the other point, I mean, I have kind of a pragmatic response and then a kind of spiritual response. My pragmatic response is that this is my writing is a resource. It's there if you want it, and if you don't, that's fine. It's there for those who would get something out of engaging with this work, with the work that I've done with the classical Unitarian tradition. it's there for those who are, for whom it will be useful, and if it's not, then it's not. And there's a question in my mind in all of this stuff of whether we are whether this General Assembly is a coalition of radically different communities who not only have a different sense of identity but have a different sense of mission, and whether it is indeed possible or desirable for us to attempt to be communally, do things, do publicity, do a sense of mission. Whether any attempt to that, or a kind of top-down sense of that, actually makes any sense. I don't. That's a question. That's a genuine question in my mind, about whether we do parallel things, and those of us who do this, and those of us who do that, and that's like, we just live with that. Okay. Yeah, the other response I'd make. The questions I want to ask around these sorts of conversations, the questions are: how do you have an ultimate sense of hope? And as we've talked about before, how do you not burn out in social justice work? If the emphasis is on this political, social justice work, how do you not burn out, right? So my answers that I can best discern out of the work that I've done in the classical Unitarian tradition is: how do you have an ultimate sense of hope? Through the act of imagination, through imagining paradise, and through practices such as reflecting on Jesus's stories, which are stories of paradise. What does this reconciliation between families look like? Is a story. What is a feast where people come from east and west together and feast together? In the Garden of Paradise, what does that look like? And the interpretation of that, because language evolves and there are different contexts in history. Someone like Martin Luther King, the expression of the promised land. So there are stories we tell from people who tell these stories and live in that place of imagination and hope, such as Martin Luther King, who tells a story about getting to a promised land. And that sense of hope, as I say, is distinctly liberal. And how do we not burn out? I think we don't burn out through spiritual practice. I think the problem with writing a book is that you have to stop writing it. And if this is a work of like 15 years, if I kind of want to write more about spiritual practice, and there had to be a point of stopping writing the book. The thing I regret, I'd like to put more about an emphasis on spiritual practice today, I think. So I think spiritual practices, we have spiritual practices within us and within the traditions. We're rooted in historically of contemplative prayer and worship, which are sustaining in that work. And within that is a sense of grace, is a sense of it doesn't all depend on me. And I think it's I want to talk about a theology of grace, not a theology of works, because I think that manifests in a kind of political sense of our sense of we must do the work, we must do this social justice work, we've got so much work to do, which is to me the anxiety of the American Unitarian Universalists, is that anxiety of social justice work. It feels very heavy to me because there doesn't feel to me a sense of grace. In the spiritual practice that I do, that I think sits within the tradition, my discovery is a discovery of love, is a discovery of of being beheld, of being beloved by lover, and that is the discovery of others as well. So I don't know if I'm answering a question or avoiding answering your question, but I want to say that's what I discover in spiritual practice. What do you discover in spiritual practice? That's the question I want to have, and that's the conversation I want to have. Yeah, I don't want to kind of have a doctrinal conversation or argument. I want to talk about out of an experience of spiritual practice,
Mm. Mm.
and that's the only meaningful place to have that conversation for me.
Yeah, yeah, and that also the sense of place is also an important element to at least touch on in this conversation. I know we haven't got much time, but here we are, or rather here we aren't, on Zoom, and you're in Cardiff as a minister, but you have no pulpit, so to speak. You have not a building anymore in Cardiff, and I think that that's also become part of the conversation. How is this work based in a church? It's a tradition, but is it based in a church? Is it on the street? Is it in activism? Is it where for you is it now? And do you feel that the pioneering ministry that you're engaged in now is opening doors, and are you making discoveries about where ministry is and where this tradition can go?
Yeah, I'm constantly saying it's early days, and it is still early days. The days are the early days are getting longer, but I in terms of the practical work that I feel like I'm in the midst of in Cardiff, it feels like a lot. It feels like, you know, years and years of work, and this is early days. Yeah, I mean, dialogue is the big kind of practice that I advocate for in the book, and yeah, dialogue through connection of different groups and different people in the streets is kind of the basis of my work. What has been surprising, and wasn't kind of planned, is how interfaith this has become.
Mm-hmm.
But those I'm connecting with are kind of faith-based activists, in which we're doing conversations and processes together around with this sense of allyship, and this sense of understanding connections between spirituality and activism, and that's kind of a conversation that is growing, that is all kinds of work. There may be a major kind of conference, symposium, festival that we will organize in the fullness of time around this, but it's really a kind of a conversation where connections are slowly drawing into a sense of this work.
Yeah. Wonderful to bring that word to focus right now, the conversation that you're having. And I'm just also from the outside aware of the way in which you've been able to gently work with existing systems and with existing activism that's going on in your context, instead of, you know, trying to set up and sort of stand there as a beacon or very much.
Yeah, because that would be a form of colonialism, to go in
right.
thinking that you have all the answers, and that you are going to impose yourself on a place, on a city, on a neighborhood with your projects, without understanding what projects already exist, and working alongside and with, and saying what is already happening that I can join in with, and find the places that I can work. That is that tension of that colonial tension exists in all of that.
I said we would ask people to put in some questions, so I'm going to look at the chat board and ask folk who have been really patiently holding your fire to set some questions to us. There's one right here. What is social justice work in practice? How do you answer that? What for you is social justice work?
In practice, yeah, it's circle around this a lot. I mean, there are, practical things. There is, I'm involved with Extinction Rebellion, maybe less than other people, and I have been. I think that there's a place for that. I've not yet made myself arrestable in that work, as many others have. And I've got some issues with Extinction Rebellion as well, but I think there's a place for it. Yeah, I'm trying not to give too highfalutin an answer. There's this a philosopher, Bayo Akumalafe, who talks about times are so urgent we must slow down, and has this very kind of poetic, philosophical way of kind of expressing this in this language of. I mean, to an extent, social justice work is spirituality, and actually, I think social justice work runs out of itself if it's not spiritually rooted. At the same time, I'm aware that might of the kind of the danger of that becomes so highfalutin. And
no, I think that you express it really well when you say that a lot of our social justice imperative, it comes from a place of anxiety, and therefore in our over eagerness, we can risk kind of falling into patterns that are colonial or at least ungracious.
Yeah. I mean, my sense of the work is linking community and spirituality and justice, and I think if you're not doing all of those things, there's problems, right? So, like, I know for Cardiff Extinction Rebellion, have conversations of, we're quite white, we're quite middle class, which is true kind of across the board, and like, how can we reach out to different communities in Cardiff and have those conversations? Fine, but actually the way you do that is by doing really, really deep community work, and other people I work with are doing that work in Cardiff, right? You can't just like put up a poster and then like expect certain communities to turn up because you've done that. But if you've been an ally in a neighborhood and known your neighbors for like 10 or 20 years, then maybe people can be part of a process of working together and doing justice work together. But if you do it without like knowing your neighbor is justice work, knowing who lives on your street is justice work, like that's one without the other is wrong.
Yeah. Have you ever come across the concept of gentle systems? There's a physicist called David Peat that I keep on being reminded of when you speak. Anyway, I'm going to loop back to a question from Marta Pacini because that's fascinating, but I'm going to also just right now ask two questions that have come in that seem to me to be interlinked. One's from Abby Thompson and the other's from Robin Hanford. So I'm going to read Abby's question. Hi, Stephen. I'm very excited to read the book. I think I might be right to say when I say that I'm the youngest in this Zoom chat now at 16. So yeah, I'm guessing you might be. What you've touched on today, I believe, is completely correct. An open dialogue of love is key to Unitarianism. So my question is, as a member, this is Abby now, as a member of Generation X, an increasingly consumerist and divided generation, how do we make sure that message of love, that message of pure, true, and holy adoration in both the divine and in ourselves as human beings is still spread? Because in my experience, many people my age are afraid to venture into religion because of how much it's hurt people in the past. So, fantastic question. And I think this one from Robin is absolutely linked, because Robin asks, what do you think is holding Unitarians back from being able to articulate a vision of hope? in the now. And so how can we do this better?
Think about that. That's beautifully put, those questions, really beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of 16-year-olds doing like amazing things in terms of the youth strikes, but are everywhere, and I've kind of gone along to a few of them, supported them at the Welsh Parliament here. I think there's a fierceness and a boldness to transform the world that I find really inspiring coming from teenagers at the moment. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to be kind of an expert about what kind of people's opinions of religion are who are that age. I mean, generalizations are always a bit problematic, aren't they? I suspect it, I don't know. I suspect it might be that actually there's fewer hang-ups for people who have got no religious background at all, which is going to be increasingly the people who are growing up, whose parents may not be religious and so have no kind of connection with religion. It's a nothing, it's not a bad experience, there's no experience. And so I think that changes the conversation a little bit. If it's not something that's part of you at all. I'm trying to think what. I mean, I'm tempted to give kind of the same answer to both questions, which is kind of the boring answer in a way, but it's like spiritual practice. Like whatever we want to do in the world, we have to do with ourselves. We have to seek to be like to enter into the depth of our spiritual practice and our practice to be lovingly transformed. And that yeah, and talk about boldness this afternoon. After there's something of that boldness, I think, that can come from that fearlessness, right?
Yes.
The processes of reflection and spiritual practice allow us to get beyond fear, I think. Yeah, let's do that.
I think both questions really also relate to a sense that I have that the classical tradition that you espouse and raise up in your book has, I think, wrongly become associated, but it has become associated with a kind of churchianity, especially in our movement. It has become associated with that which is holding us back. And I kind of feel like a pressing need, an urgent need to kind of reframe that and reassess that and change that up. And maybe in some ways, this moment we're going through is part of changing things in that way. But that does relate to Marta's question. Marta Pacini has asked, when you talk about the classical Unitarian tradition, what is it in opposition to? Is it opposed to a non-classical tradition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose, yeah, I mean, it means what is the kind of the roots and the stories that have been going, that go back centuries. But I suppose I see what it isn't as, I guess what I lay myself against is a blank slate ideology that there's just a space in which anything can be plopped in, and that's what we're doing. So I don't want to express myself negatively in a way, but if I'm invited to express myself negatively, and what I'm disagreeing with is an ideology that of blank space in which whatever can be inserted.
and that blank space, it can be problematic because it presents, it
Because it's
defaults
not blank.
well, exactly, it defaults to individualism.
It defaults to individualism, and it doesn't recognize, it's a false universalism that doesn't recognize the historical realities, everything that we always bring to everything, that whatever, if we think we're being neutral, we never are, because we're always bringing our social positioning and language.
Yeah.
Everything we're doing, we're always bringing. To use a language is to bring a story with you. So if you're using a language, you're bringing. I mean, I heard a Unitarian phrase about, we don't impose like a language on you. It's like, well, you have to impose it. You have to, if you're using a language, you are bringing something with that language. It's impossible to operate outside of language, and therefore outside of particular historical ways of looking at things. We're bringing lots of particular historical ways of looking at things in terms of an Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment, postmodern kind of atomized individualist philosophy which exists in our culture. It's not. That's not a Maasai culture, for example. That's a particular expression of in this place in this time, right?
Yeah.
It is not culturally neutral. It is particularly from a cultural place.
Right. Absolutely.
So let's understand what that cultural and spiritual and historical thing is.
Because it's impossible to speak language in general.
Right.
So in affirming tradition, it's not actually in opposition to an other tradition, but simply an affirmation of your need and right to be articulate and to be able to communicate.
To be aware of what traditions we are always a part of.
So Peter has asked, how do you engage with the white colonial aspect of yourself when working with systems? It's a tough road.
Yeah. Gosh. I mean, I think it's the constant. I think it's the constant spiritual practice, the constant spiritual demand of being white. I think is to constantly work on that. I think it's listening is a large part of it. Being in a place of I mean, I don't want to lift myself up as someone who's got my crap together on this kind of stuff. But I would hope it's a process of being aware of what power you have through who you are, and sometimes holding back to allow space for other people if possible.
But listening, and it seems psychologically and therapeutically valid to say that if we don't acknowledge something, if we don't bring something to consciousness, we can't deal with it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's something of the practice of truth telling. Revealing what is.
Yes. Your book, and we didn't get time really to talk about this element of your prioritizing truth and how that works for you. And so this, I think, contributes and comes close to Jeff Livermore's question. Jeff says, you mentioned theologians, but do any philosophers contribute to your thought?
I mean, I'm certainly more of a theologian than I'm a philosopher, completely. But obviously these things are built on each other. The one that there's probably other people that I could think. The one that comes to mind is Alistair McIntosh, who's kind of a Aristotelian ethics kind of guy. Although it's a very it's a very bloody hard book. The book that I read, what was it? What's it called? After Ethics. Is it called After Ethics? I can't remember now. Something like that.
Yeah.
But that deeply influenced kind of Brian Stone, who's a guy I sort of knew in Boston, though he didn't actually teach me. He's written a great book about evangelism. And in the conversation we've just been having, in that, what I've just said comes a lot from him, from a sense of the historical rootedness of the work that we're doing. That sort of stuff around language and his the historical realities of what we're doing.
And that's the other Alistair McIntosh I should put a disambiguation in.
Alistair McIntyre, that's it. Alistair McIntyre. I always get the two mixed up.
The philosopher. Yeah, not the Alistair McIntosh.
Not Alistair McIntosh. So Alistair McIntosh is great too. And I love his book, and I'm going to see his thing as well this week.
Yeah. So I'm going to now say so this is another really great question. This is from Bridport and Bristol Unitarians. I really want to read your book. Listen, everybody, you really should.
That's what we're here for.
I have just purchased a dozen copies for Mill Hill Chapel, because at the end of each of these chapters in Stephen's book, there's questions for reflection and discussion. And so what we're going to do is read the book together in our isolation, and then we're going to set up a meeting community to go through the questions at the conclusion of each chapter. And I'm recommending that all of our congregations should do the same. Buy a dozen copies, straight arm your treasurer, get a dozen copies, get them out in the post to your isolated congregational members, and let's engage with this stuff. It's a fantastic book, and it really is worth our while if we take seriously the catastrophic cliff fall decline in numbers. We need to engage with this. But anyway, I'm going to carry on with the question. We need more Unitarian theologians. Strongly agree. I have always been puzzled by why our beloved faith isn't more widely known about or part of our culture. What is your view on this? So that's the question, I guess, is why aren't we more widely known? Why aren't we more in the center of our culture?
I don't know why we aren't more widely known is probably the answer. I think, well, I mean, I think we're probably about as widely known as you'd expect us to be honest, for a movement of 3,000 people. I mean, I think, that the sort of Quakers have, as well as Oates, just like the peace thing, and that's an easy, that people know kind of silence and peace with Quakers, and they don't, there's struggles to pin something like that onto us. In that there's a lot more to Quakerism than silence and peace, but it's not a bad first impression. Why aren't we more widely known?
It's become the theological hook by which we hang a hat on on Quakerism, peace work, and we have never articulated such a precise aim as Unitarians, but we could do. And your articulation of this idea of the eternal now, of the kingdom as opposed to the kingdom, of connection and the emergence into the moment of paradise,
Mm.
You know, these are ideas that could absolutely galvanize spiritual action and activity. We just need to find ways of expressing them more clearly.
Yeah, and I guess like I'm interested in kind of the microscopic, not the macroscopic. Like
Uh-huh.
I'm like I'm interested in whether like my neighbors know who I am and that they might think I'm an okay person. Like because I think if it's not happening on that level, then like all national publicity campaign, blah 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 blah. Like I, I'm really just not. I really just don't think on those levels. I'm very so we're all isolated and very not moving about very much in this moment. But like my world is like a mile long in my ministry. It's these kind of few streets between here and there. And that like I just want to do work in a few streets for 20 years and see what's possible doing that rather than like oh national blah 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 blah. It's just like it just doesn't it's just like not my calling to like to think on that level in a way like
You said something very useful a couple of GAs ago when we were in a meeting around um, articulating Unitarianism and publicity. And you said that we can't rebrand our way out of a crisis. And
right
that before we do the work of identity, we have to do the work of theology. And I profoundly agree with that notion. And I think that another one of those wounded words, unfortunately, within our movement is theology. Um, and it's needlessly so. And I really applaud your work in bringing that whole subject out into the open in an accessible way that actually deals with the now, with the issues around us. This is our context. Um, it couldn't be clearer.
yeah theology is asking the why question um as far down as it goes
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I know we haven't um, gone as deeply into that question of the why as you do in your book, but these ideas of faith and truth and hope and love and brilliantly you point out how we changed our attitudes to the world over the history of mission in Unitarianism from wishing to share what we have to wishing that people would come in and fill our pews.
mm.
And the fundamental difference between those two attitudes, that there's the kind of mission that's based on preserving our institution as opposed to widening out hope and love and faith and truth and courage.
yeah we only talk about church growth in that context when we're declining. The growing movement doesn't talk in those terms. Only a declining movement talks in the terms of church growth.
Yeah.
But when we were doing, you know, if you go back to the domestic missionaries in kind of Liverpool and Manchester and Birmingham, London, in the 1830s, you know, that wasn't from a motivation. I mean, there are problems with that this as well, but it wasn't from motivations. We need people to come fill our pews. It was like, let's go to the slums and let's do the religious work in the slums that needs doing because we think there are needs there that need addressing. You know, there are particular paternalistic issues in all of that, and issues of power and all of that. But it was like, let's go to where people are, not like, oh, we need people to come to us to
Yeah.
hold up what institutions already exist. We need to go out and create new institutions or communities.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, I'm so grateful to you, Stephen, for sharing so clearly, so articulately with us some of the work that you've done. I know that it's, as you say, it's 15 years worth of work that you've somehow managed to distill into Seeking Paradise, and I really, I know that you're right. Sometimes you just have to stop what you're working on. It isn't finished, but you've stopped
Yeah.
and you've published it, and it's really great. It's an excellent book, and I hope everybody buys it. But I also hope that you do continue and write that next work, because that's important too. I really want to encourage you to do that, and I hope.
Give me a decade or two.
No, swifter than that, please. I want a shorter deadline. I just want to thank you again, and I thank everybody here for sharing with us. I'm really sorry that I haven't been able to see everybody. I'm switch out to the gallery.
Yeah, I'm going to switch back to gallery view to be able to see everyone as well and say hello. Hello, everyone, or not everyone, but lots of numbers of everyone. Nice to see faces.
And so with that, I'm going to close and wish everybody a great rest of your day. Oh yeah, smashing. I'm really glad to see other people have got the book too. But thank you so much. It's been great to have you here, and really brilliant to talk to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. Thanks for everyone for organising all this.
Bye all. Bye.